A new Wordle puzzle is online. Click on the link to play.
Listening to the following video may give you clues. Please like and share the videos.
Texas death row prisoner Melissa Lucio grants stay of execution. In a recent decision, a Texas appeals court ordered the trial court to consider new evidence and issues on the merits.
Lucio's legal team filed a clemency petition highlighting 9 different arguments. 4 of those arguments were found to have merit, including the contention that the prosecutors suppressed favorable material evidence.
If those arguments are not enough, the court has ordered a new trial. Melissa Lucio was sexually abused as a young girl.
According to a new petition filed by the family of Texas death row prisoner Melissa Lucio, the prosecution's case against her was politically motivated. The former district attorney of the case was convicted of bribery and a corruption trial and is now in federal prison.
Lucio also said that her trial was flawed because key witnesses were excluded, and that her testimony about the abuse was irrelevant. In addition to the sexual abuse Lucio suffered as a child, she was also abused by her own partners, which continued throughout her adolescence.
Lucio's first husband abandoned her and their 5 children when she was only 16. Then her second husband, Robert Alvarez, continued the vicious cycle and abused Melissa.
Melissa Lucio had no other option but to get married and have 9 more children, all of whom were sexually abused by Robert Alvarez. During the trial, Melissa Lucio was coercively interrogated by police officers.
The officers intimidated her for 5 hours and used coercive tactics to coerce her into giving a false confession. Survivors of sexual abuse are often more vulnerable to false confessions, and this is true here.
Experts studied the interrogation records and determined that Lucio was heavily manipulated. Although clemency of female death row inmates is rare in the United States, recent appeals of 2 Texas women have garnered much public attention.
They have also sparked debate about larger issues. In particular, the case of Texas death row prisoner Melissa Lucio is being scrutinized by psychiatric experts who believe that survivors of trauma are prone to blame others for their trauma.
As a result, 5 jurors have now called for the clemency of Lucio and her family. She denied harming 2-year-old Mariah.
On February 15, 2007, Lucio and her husband moved to another apartment in Texas. The older 2 children stayed upstairs and played in the yard while Lucio packed the family's possessions.
Lucio was tasked with watching her daughter, who was 2 at the time. Mariah was a fragile child who fell frequently due to a mild physical disability.
Suddenly, Lucio noticed that Mariah was missing. After an hour, Lucio went downstairs and discovered Mariah in the yard.
The toddler was crying, and she had blood on her lower teeth. While Lucio maintained her innocence, the prosecution claimed that she abused the child.
During interrogation, Lucio denied hitting the child more than 100 times. Lucio admitted that she occasionally spanked Mariah on her buttocks, but she denied beating her daughter to death.
Lucio has repeatedly denied ever abusing the child. While her attorneys pointed to her inconsistent testimony, they maintain that Lucio has not admitted to abusing the child.
Despite the evidence that she killed her daughter, Lucio's defense has continued to argue that she did not cause the death. Lucio's attorneys cite scientific explanations for the bruising on Mariah's body and other evidence that demonstrates abuse.
This is a common reason for violent death in Texas. However, a review of the autopsy reports by a pathologist showed that the mother of Mariah possessed a blood coagulation disorder and did not identify the cause of the child's death until 2 days later.
But despite these findings, Lucio's attorneys are now pursuing new appeals. They argue that the jury was denied the opportunity to hear Lucio's full defense.
Her lawyers argue that Lucio was denied the chance to present her defense because she was not allowed to call key experts during the trial. A psychologist and social worker who was hired to testify at the trial were excluded, which they say unfairly influenced the verdict.
She was convicted on basis of coerced confession. In March 2014, the Texas Supreme Court upheld the conviction of Melissa Lucio on coerced confession grounds.
The Texas Supreme Court also upheld the convictions of 5 other inmates. These inmates had claimed that Lucio was deprived of counsel during interrogation and had suffered a history of abuse.
A sixth conviction for failing to cooperate during interrogation was also upheld. However, the Texas Board of Pardons rejected clemency recommendations and remanded Melissa Lucio back to the Texas death row.
It was discovered that Lucio had been coerced by police officers, and they tortured and intimidated her over the course of 5 hours. Melissa was pregnant at the time of the interrogation, and police used various coercive techniques to coerce her into a false confession.
Because Lucio was under intense pressure during interrogation, she was vulnerable to false confessions. Experts in this area have reviewed interrogation records and concluded that Melissa was manipulated heavily.
The case has caused great distress to Lucio's family, including her children. It has uncovered old wounds and traumas that had never fully healed.
Despite her children's acquiescence, the family has been traumatized by her story. Execution would have been the last straw for the family.
And it would have ruined the life of her children, whom she loved dearly. Despite the intricacies of the case, the appeals court's decision does not change the underlying conviction of Lucio.
As a result, the Texas Supreme Court upheld her conviction on coerced confession. Moreover, Lucio's lawyers argued that new evidence would exonerate her.
However, Scenes disagreed with these arguments, saying he would seek a stay of execution on this basis. She was abused as a young girl.
Melissa Lucio was a child victim of sexual abuse, which left her vulnerable to repeated victimization. She was raped by her mother's boyfriend and married a violent alcoholic at 16 years old.
Her first husband abandoned her after giving birth to 5 children, and her second one continued the pattern of violence. Her subsequent boyfriend, Robert Alvarez, continued the cycle of violence and abuse.
During the trial, the prosecution and defense failed to investigate at least 100 allegations of child abuse, so the prosecution was not able to use this evidence to convince the jury that Lucio was innocent. While the judge decided not to let the defense present evidence of her abuse as a child, she failed to investigate the other 100 allegations.
Her trial did not allow 2 defense experts to testify that Lucio was abused as a child by her former husband. Despite these inconsistencies, she has filed an appeal against this ruling.
Hundreds of anti-domestic violence and sexual assault organizations in Texas have signed a letter asking the state to grant clemency for Lucio. The letter was also signed by over 100 Texas legislators.
There are hundreds of other supporters, including 18 exonerees, 130 evangelical and Catholic faith leaders, and over 100 organizations dedicated to the cause. After her trial, the U.S.
Supreme Court declined to hear her case. In her appeal, attorneys and advocates questioned the Texas Rangers' claim that Lucio was passive and ready to confess.
The truth is that victims of trauma often develop psychological reactions and look guilty even when they are not. A spokesman for Escalon declined to comment on the case.
A recent report in the New York Times reported the story of Lucio. She was convicted on basis of a coerced confession.
The appeals process was delayed until December after a third jury rejected the acquittal, ruling that the defendant had made an untrue confession. However, a forensic pathologist testified that the victim did not request an attorney when she was convicted, an admission that shocked the defense lawyers.
The forensic pathologist told a different story, arguing that the witness was coerced into giving the confession. Defense argues that the police's testimony was based on false evidence.
The prosecution maintains that Lucio's daughter died from blunt force head trauma and that the emergency room doctor who examined Mariah called the case the worst child abuse case ever. Lucio's lawyers argue that the state's story is based on faulty science and that the evidence is insufficient to convict her of the crime.
If this is true, Lucio's team plans to file new claims in court and ask Gov. Rick Perry to commute her sentence.
While Scenes was not present at the meeting, he did remotely join the meeting and publicly addressed the case. He seemed indifferent to the new evidence presented and unaware of even basic facts of Lucio's case.
He denied withdrawing the death warrant and pointed to legal issues pending at the time of the trial and said he would intervene if necessary. While this appeals court decision was rare, the decision is important in light of the fact that many other prisoners who have been convicted on the basis of coerced confessions have successfully won their cases.
She is awaiting execution on April 27, 2022. During this time, her defense will attempt to make the case more favorable for the clemency petition.